Hello, everyone, and welcome. This is another episode of Financing Philadelphia's Future. Just a couple of getting ready notes here. Please set your screen to speaker view. That's the best way to watch us and engage. You can use the icon on the top right of your screen for that. Enter questions in the chat, please. We want to get questions from you. We want to engage with our guest today. And let us know which section of the city you're chatting from. And then please put your email in the chat box if you want to join the Philadelphia Public Banking Coalition email list to be notified of future meetings. So these are our monthly sessions sponsored by the Philadelphia Public Banking Coalition. We want to keep the conversation going about the creation of a public bank for Philadelphia. My name is Vanessa Lowe, and I am your host. I am a member of the Public Banking Coalition. I am co-chair of the Power Economic Dignity team, and I also host a show called Vanessa's Money Hour on G-Town Radio. Welcome, everybody, and particularly welcome to our guest, Cydnea Sheards. Cydnea, let me ask if I'm saying that name right.
Yes, you are.
Okay. Welcome so much. Let me do a brief introduction, and then I'm going to turn it over to you to give us a few words. It's a quick half hour, so we try to jump right in. So Cydnea Sheards is the Director of Legislation and Policy for Philadelphia Councilmember Jamie Gauthier. In that role, she's worked to create policies prioritizing affordable housing preservation, combating gun violence, and investing in community-based assets like parks and recreation centers. Ms. Sheards' community involvement also focuses on community improvement. As a volunteer attorney handling tangled title cases for Philadelphia VIP, she's demonstrated her commitment to maintaining housing stability for low-income residents. Ms. Sheards completed her undergraduate studies at Howard University and earned a law degree at Temple University Beasley School of Law. Welcome again, Ms. Sheards. Please say hello to the audience and give us a few words.
Thanks, Vanessa. Good afternoon, everybody. I'd like to thank you all for having me here today. As Vanessa so eloquently said, I am Cydnea Sheards. I am the Director of Legislation and Policy for Philadelphia 3rd District Councilmember Jamie Gauthier. And I'm here today to discuss the council member's legislative priorities and how those legislative priorities are tied into a public banking solution.
Fantastic. All right. We're going to have questions coming into the chat, and I will turn to Peter or whoever raises their hand to give me some questions. But please get us started, Cydnea, and maybe give us a brief background on Councilmember Gauthier and maybe jump into maybe her most important priority that is related to public banking.
You got it. All right. So since Councilmember Gauthier took office in January 2020, her agenda has been focused on creating equitable communities. And she defines that as when quality of life outcomes, affordable housing, living wage, employment, healthy environments, and accessible transportation are experienced by the people currently living in communities. So that means that regardless of whether you live in Cobb's Creek or whether you live in the Fairmount section of the city, you have access to SEPTA that runs regularly, solid schools, solid parks. You don't live in a food desert. You are living in the community where you essentially don't need to leave to do things necessary to your day-to-day. She has focused on creating equity in housing. And as a district council member, she has the ability to do that through land use policies. One of, or rather not even one of, a handful of her legislative initiatives that have prioritized housing and equity in housing have been the mixed income neighborhoods zoning overlay, the public land for public benefit bill, better known as the community land trust bill, and the people's preservation package. And if you give me a little bit of leeway, I can explain what those three things are.
Leeway.
Thank you.
Go for it.
The mixed income neighborhood zoning overlay is a bill that requires new development within the boundary of the overlay to provide a certain percentage of affordable housing on site. And then if they're not providing that housing, some of the housing can also be off-site, but if there is housing off-site, the property developer would have to make a contribution to the city's housing trust fund, which is woefully underfunded, might I add. The public land for public benefit bill is probably going to take up most of my time today. And it is a bill that provides a pathway for community-focused, community-centered organizations to fund acquisition of city land. It creates a pathway for them to acquire land from the city so that we can create more green spaces it's essentially community land for community control. You want the lots in your community to be gardens, greenhouses. You want those gardens and greenhouses to be run by people who live where you live. And so the public land bill is focused on creating pathways for these community organizations to access city land in a way that is not crippling them financially or requiring a very competitive process that our nonprofit friends can't compete in. And lastly, but not leastly, we have the People's Preservation Package, which the council member introduced towards the end of 2022. It involves 2 bills and 1 resolution. One bill that would change the notice requirement for low income property developers who would like to opt out of their affordability subsidies, as well as creating a city maintained subsidy directory so that we have an idea of when expiring use properties are coming up, so we don't experience situations where people are receiving notice that they need to be out of their apartments and there's not really anything that can be done to change that. There was also a hearing hosted by the council member in the Committee on Housing, Neighborhood Development, and the Homeless back in the spring to address source of income discrimination and how that source of income discrimination for our city's voucher holders is exacerbating an already hectic affordability crisis. I think that is where I am going to stop. And too long didn't read. The council member believes that housing is a human right, and we are focusing on legislative priorities that to some extent could be helped by public banking solutions, and are prioritizing housing for our most vulnerable Philadelphians.
Thank you. Thank you for summarizing those 3 pieces of legislation. I know that, well, I know the middle one has been, they've been around for a while, right? So tell us the status of each and what sort of barriers you're facing, and what we have activists who are involved, you know, in our coalition, and we have connections. And so what is it? Because I know that Jamie Gauthier and a couple of other council members are really engaged with the community, and we really appreciate that. So what's the status, what's holding it back, and what can we do to help?
Great. So with the public land for public benefit bill, it started out as a citywide pathway for community land trust. So regardless of which district your land trust is operating in, it will be one uniform blanket policy for all. Over the course of between introduction, committee hearings, and the like, the original version of the community land trust bill was changed to only affect the 3rd and 4th council districts. So in those 2 districts, there is still a pathway for community land trusts to have community control of land. Where we are right now is working with our friends over at the Land Bank and in the administration to determine what that process looks like. The legislation sets forth a framework for the pathway to community owned or community leased land. And we are working out with the administration exactly what that's going to look like once the bill is in effect, once we're receiving applications for non-competitive land dispositions. With the People's Preservation Package, ironically enough, even though it passed about a year, well, a few months after the public land bill, we are in the exact same place. So we are in the process of developing the city subsidy directory. There are tens of thousands of these properties. that have these affordability subsidies that are set to expire in the next 5 to 10 years. And so we are basically just making our Venn diagrams a perfect circle. We've had help from GIS folks with the city, we've had help from LIST, and we are all putting our subsidy list together to make the most comprehensive version of the list as possible. And then with the notice requirements, we are hammering out the details in education, essentially. The bill sets forth which properties this applies to, but lots of people who aren't necessarily familiar with federal code will look at the bill and say, I don't know if this applies to me or not. We tried to solve that up front by giving things commonplace names as well, but we are basically about to set forth on an education campaign so that folks know what applies to them, what doesn't, and what is now required of them under these new bills.
Thank you. So I just saw an update, I think yesterday, about how many people are left in University City townhomes, which got a lot of attention, in large part because the activists and the people who live there were really protesting about that. They're like, I've lived here for 20 years and all of a sudden now I'm being kicked out because the landlord, I guess the owner of the building, correct me if I'm wrong, the time commitment for keeping it as low-income housing was up and he wanted to sell it for $1 million. Am I summarizing that well? I
wish that the building was, or that the property was being sold for $1 million. That might have made affordability proposals a lot easier upfront. The number was probably closer to around 70 million. And essentially what happened was there was, for anyone who has been living under a rock for the last year and a half or so, there is an affordable housing property at the corner of 40th and Market that houses 70 some odd family housing units. And the owner of their property, when their subsidy came up for renewal, decided to opt out of renewing the property and sell it. They provided the adequate notice under federal housing laws to their residents, but still, like you were saying, for people who have lived in that building for 20 years, it came as a shock to them that they needed to be out of the building by the next July. And that's just not an equitable solution. The university townhomes were essentially built as an apology for how residents were pushed out of their communities during the urban renewal that occurred in the 60s and 70s. And so people who have been in those apartments since then are saying, I'm being displaced again. And obviously that's not the outcome that we want. So that's where the council member stepped in. And through negotiation with the property owner and the council member, they were able to come to a solution where the city will maintain a very large chunk of that property that will allow the city to build and maintain affordable housing in perpetuity. And though the townhomes are empty now, the residents will all have the option to come back to the new development that is built. And they were also awarded a settlement of around $3 million that'll be split between them.
Thank you for that update. I had not read that piece, so that's very, very exciting. Thank you for that. Let's get some questions in here about the relationship with the council members' programs and the public bank. Peter, can I turn to you? I think I saw some questions in the chat.
Thank you, Vanessa. And Cydnea, we're very concerned that there hasn't been appropriate anticipation of the turnover. We've known that this was happening or going to be happening for 40 years, and we sort of were caught flat-footed. We're very thankful that Councilmember Gauthier has jumped into the rescue on all this. When we look at these issues of community land trust, we tend to put them, since we're approaching this from the financing side, we tend to put them in 3 buckets. One having to do with community gardens, one having to do with development of affordable housing, and the third, the accessibility and programs that would deal with a commercial district, commercial corridor. Are those, because each one has their own financing requirements that are very, very different one from the other. Is that the way that you're looking at this also?
Yes and no. Because any funding solution that seeks to address these issues kind of has to juggle a great many spinning plates. And so in creating solutions to these issues, you have to take into account essentially each issue on its own. So there's no like one blanket solution. So there's no one blanket funding solution. And so essentially when these issues come up, especially with properties with expiring subsidies, because public funding has essentially been decreased over time the way it has, any new solution has to take into account these decreases, the difficulty upfront that there is applying for public money for community-minded development. And I realize that I'm rambling and I may have not answered your question.
That's okay. We get the flavor, and the flavor is very important in all of this as well. We really appreciate that Councilmember Gauthier is taking the lead within the 3rd District, and by proof of concept of what can be done for her constituents, give an example of what can be done with the rest of the city. We think that's a wonderful approach to take as well. Vanessa, if I can shift to another concern that we have. Cydnea, we're very much aware that there's been a big turnover in City Council, with a lot of members of City Council leaving after the vote for Ordinance 210956A to establish the financial authority. And council members left to run for mayor. But now, with the elections in the fall, there'll be a new crop of people coming in who have come in after the legislation was passed. We're concerned that council members may not be sufficiently aware of all the issues involved with the financial authority and with a public bank. And we're wondering what you think the state of knowledge is among the staff and the members of council, and what we can do together, what we can do to help you, what you can do to help us to bring all these people on City Council up to speed about these issues.
Well, I can't speak for the terrain that we might have come January. But regardless of what happens, you're right, there will be a handful of new folks, more than likely new staff, and they will all have varying levels of experience and understanding with public financing solutions. However, I don't think that that's particularly different than what led up to the vote to establish the public banking institution to begin with. You had council members who all had different levels of understanding, and there was a education campaign, albeit spearheaded by one individual council member, to educate their peers on this particular piece of legislation and what it could do. And so I don't really see a need to reinvent the wheel. I think you just start from scratch with those new council members. You find your council member buddy, and they are responsible for spearheading the educational campaign on what is possible through this legislation to all of the new council members. And that doesn't go without saying that some of these council members, because they are residents of the city, because they've run for office, are already to at least some extent familiar with the legislation, what it can do, and how they can be helpful in implementing it.
Thank you. There are several initiatives that the coalition is looking at these days. We're looking at a Bring Our Money Home campaign, and we're also looking at having discussions with our pension funds, especially the city pension funds, of applying their investments more locally and to the concerns that we need to address, which includes affordable housing and environmental issues and minority-owned small business development and so forth. do you think that the council members would be interested in looking at the extent to which some parts of city pension funds could be used to support these kinds of programs of useful enterprises located in Philadelphia?
I do. And I also think that, but also I do think that that's a conversation to be had with the council, like the CFO for council, the CFO of the city. There is always a conversation to be had with the folks in charge of figuring out what money goes where when we want to use that money for a new thing. And because I am not our budgeting wizard, Bob McDermott, I can't really speak to any of the pension fund allocations that we have going on in the future, but I do think that that's a solid place to start. I do think that council is in a place where they are presently open to new ideas. There's about to be a lot of turnover. There's a lot of space for innovation there.
That's terrific. And since you were talking about the buddy system among council members, and Councilmember Gauthier is our champion for public banking and the financial authority, how might we be a good buddy with our buddy to make all of that happen? What can we do how can we help you? Help us, help you.
I think you're already doing the thing. I mean, I'm here because of the very transparent relationship that you have with the council member. Had the council member not had a prior commitment out doing the people's business somewhere, she would have been here. And so I think that by harnessing the relationship that you have with Councilmember Gauthier and the relationships that she has with her council colleagues, you can effectively build the coalition that is ready to do the work necessary to grow this financial institution.
That's terrific. And would Councilman Gauthier be supportive of our efforts to expand the list of certified city depository institutions? There are now, I think, 14, but they are the large banks as opposed to some of our local institutions like our MDIs, our minority depository institutions. Would the council member be supportive of expanding the list of city depositories to include some local institutions?
This is where I draw my line of I can't speak for my boss. Conceptually, yes, but I think that requires a bit more conversation with experts. I think that requires a bit more face-to-face time discussing what that looks like, how she could be a part of it, and what kind of lift that would require. But as an idea, sure.
That's terrific. Thank you. Vanessa, can I turn it back to you?
Sure. I'm going to toggle a little bit. We got about 6 more minutes, but I wanted to pick up on the work that you do as a volunteer on tangled titles. I've covered that on my show a couple of times. It's a very big issue in Germantown, but I know throughout the whole city. How's that been going? Particularly, I know that significant funding was made available to, I think, the 3 different legal aid services so that they could do even more assistance and direct work with a lot of people who are stuck in tangled titles and can't move forward on home renovations and things like that. Give us a summary of that.
This is my time to put out my little bat signal in the sky for all of my fellow legal professionals who are looking to get some CLE credits, get some additional experience. People can't access that money without volunteer attorneys. And right now we have a supply and demand problem. So there's only one me, and for every one me, I might be able, on top of my day-to-day 9 to 5, I might be able to handle a handful of tangled title cases over the course of a year. Tangled title cases also take an eternity to resolve. So you have to be able to follow a client from point A to point Z. And because of that, we need significantly more participation on a volunteer basis to give people the access to the Tangled title funding that they need. It costs around, and thanks to our buddies at Pew for this information, it costs around $10,000 to, at like the most basic of basic Tangled title cases, it takes around $10,000 in a year to undo. And that's just one level of Tangle. That's just I am a direct heir and I am trying to get this property in my name. That doesn't count your grandparents, your great-grandparents, your great aunts. The more layers of Tangle you have, the more time and money it takes. And because we are experiencing this very high demand and not necessarily the amount of lawyers that we need to handle that demand, is a very slow going process. And because of that, people are waiting months and months and months to even get to the point where they've been assigned an attorney that can help them. They are missing out on being able to apply for payment plans for utilities that they're getting behind on. They're not able to apply for whole home repair through the city because they're not the title owner of the home. And so all of these things that the city has in place to keep people in their houses are not available because they are not the owner of records. And essentially what ends up happening, because people can't get onto these payment plans, they can't draw on the equity in these properties, they're losing these properties, which is essentially, again, increasing the already exacerbated affordability crisis that we're having. Now, not only are we having problems with rent and how high rents are and how wages aren't matching the rent, for people who do own their homes, they're not being able to keep these homes in their families because they can't draw on the programs the city has in place to keep them in their homes. So I say all that to say, if you are a lawyer who is looking to expand your realm of expertise, if you are a probate, trust, and estate person, or if you're not, you should be using your free time to help these clients with their Tangled title cases to keep more Philadelphians in their homes.
Cydnea,
Who should they?
the Sheriff Bilal is also involved with Tangled titles and so on. Are you coordinating the resources that the sheriff has that can help in this effort?
Not through my actual job, no. I am just a direct one-to-one volunteer with Philadelphia VIP.
Thank you.
I know that there's been a change of the registrar of wills. And the last registrar, Tracy Gordon, I believe was her name, one of the things she passed was a piece of just sort of a rule that allowed, I think, the cost of some of the probate to be put to the back end. With a change in leadership in that office, will that continue, do you know?
About that, I'm not sure, but I can note that there is a distinction between what the legal aid agencies are doing and the Register of Wills programs. Yes, that allows you to put these costs off, but they do still require payment by the individual applying for the program, either upfront or through a lien on the property, whereas money offered through the Tangled Title Fund is money that does not need to be paid back.
Great.
And so people are potentially wary of one versus the other because they don't want to potentially be stuck with additional debt.
Of course. Cydnea, thank you so much. We're almost out of time, but since you put that bat signal out for those who want to respond, who do they call? How do they reach out?
Oh, well, lawyers know how to use the internet. It's a thing we're very good at. And so you can go to Philadelphia VIP's website, and one of the great big banners at the top of the page is how to be a volunteer. Or you can reach out to your local bar organizations, your local affinity groups, and they can get you hooked up with some of these legal aid agencies as well.
Fantastic. Thank you so much for your work. Thank you for joining us here. And thank you all for joining us today. We'll see you next month. Have a great day.
Thank you for having me.